The water is narrow here, only 21 miles wide at its tightest point, and yet nearly 20% of the world's oil passes through it every single day. Now imagine that passage, sealed. Imagine a line of American warships stretching across the horizon, engines running, weapons hot, standing between Iran and the rest of the world. This isn't a movie. This isn't a war game. This could be the next chapter of history. What would a U.S. naval blockade of Iran actually look like? What happens to the world if it does? And most importantly, how close are we? Welcome back to the channel where we break down the world's most complex conflicts, crises, and military flashpoints, so that you don't have to read a 400-page intelligence briefing. I'm glad you're here today, because this topic, a potential U.S. naval blockade of Iran, is one of the most discussed, most feared, and least understood scenarios in modern geopolitics. In the next 12 to 15 minutes, here's what we're going to unpack: the history behind U.S.-Iran naval tensions, the geography that makes the Strait of Hormuz so critical, what a blockade would actually involve militarily, legally, and economically, Iran's countermeasures, and the terrifying global ripple effects that would follow. This is a deep dive. Stay with me. And if you want more content like this, geopolitical analysis, military strategy, and the stories behind the headlines, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. New videos every week. Let's get into it. Before we talk about blockades and battleships, we need to understand the geography. Because geography is destiny. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway sitting between Iran to the north and the UAE and Oman to the south. At its narrowest point, it is just 21 miles wide. But the navigable shipping lanes? Each one is only 2 miles wide. 2 miles. And through those 2 miles, every single day, somewhere between 17 and 21 million barrels of oil pass through. That is roughly 1/5 of all the oil consumed on planet Earth. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar. All of them, their oil exports depend on this strait. If the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, oil prices don't just rise. They potentially double or triple. Supply chains collapse. Aviation fuel becomes scarce. Heating oil in European winters runs short. This is why military strategists call it the world's most critical chokepoint. And Iran knows this. Iran has known this for decades. Their entire strategic deterrence is built around one idea. Touch us and we close the strait, and the world burns with us. But here's where it gets complicated. Because the United States, for just as long, has operated under a doctrine that says this: freedom of navigation through international waters is non-negotiable. We will keep it open, by force if necessary. 2 superpowers, 1 narrow passage, and the world watching from both sides. To understand this flashpoint, we have to go back. All the way back to 1979. When the Islamic Revolution swept Iran, it didn't just change a government. It shattered the U.S.-Iran relationship entirely. The hostage crisis, the severing of diplomatic ties, decades of sanctions. But the naval dimension? It escalated in the 1980s during what became known as the Tanker War, part of the broader Iran-Iraq War. Iran began attacking oil tankers, mining shipping lanes, threatening the very freedom of navigation that the U.S. had pledged to protect. America responded with Operation Earnest Will, the largest naval convoy operation since World War II. U.S. warships physically escorted Kuwaiti oil tankers through the strait. And then came one of the most tragic moments in this long history. On July 3, 1988, the USS Vincennes, a U.S. Navy cruiser operating in the strait, shot down Iran Air Flight 655, a civilian passenger jet. 290 people, all dead. The U.S. said it was a mistake, confused for a military aircraft in a combat environment. Iran called it a war crime. That wound has never healed. Fast forward through the 1990s, 2000s, the nuclear deal attempts, the Iran deal of 2015, the U.S. withdrawal from it in 2018. Tensions have fluctuated, but the fundamental conflict has never resolved. Iran has continued its nuclear program. The U.S. has continued its maximum pressure sanctions campaign. And in the waters of the Persian Gulf, both navies, American and Iranian, continue to probe each other. Seizures of tankers, drone incidents, near collisions, harassment of U.S. vessels. The Strait of Hormuz has been a slow-burning fuse for over 40 years. So what happens when someone finally lights it? Let's be precise here, because the word blockade gets thrown around a lot, and most people don't know what it actually means operationally. A naval blockade is the act of using military force to prevent ships from entering or exiting a specific area. In this case, cutting off Iran's access to and from the Strait of Hormuz. Under international law, a blockade is considered an act of war. So what would it take? The United States would likely deploy what the Navy calls a carrier strike group. That's an aircraft carrier, 2 guided missile cruisers, several destroyers, submarines, and support vessels. Together, they form a floating city of military power. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, which is permanently stationed in Bahrain, would lead operations, combined with assets from the Seventh Fleet if tensions escalated. The blockade itself would not be a physical wall of ships. The strait is too wide and too deep for that. Instead, it would operate through layered denial. Surveillance aircraft and drones monitoring every vessel. Submarines patrolling below. Surface ships ready to intercept. Fighter jets on standby from the carrier deck. Any Iranian vessel, military or commercial, attempting to leave Iranian ports and enter the broader Gulf or the Indian Ocean would face interception, boarding, or the threat of force. And here's the dimension that most people overlook. Cyberspace. A modern blockade wouldn't just be physical. It would involve cyber attacks on Iranian port infrastructure, GPS spoofing, electronic warfare, jamming Iranian radar and communications. The U.S. Cyber Command and NSA have reportedly developed extensive cyber capabilities targeting Iranian military networks. A blockade would almost certainly include a cyber component on day one. But here's the question that keeps military planners up at night. What does Iran do in response? Iran cannot match the United States in a conventional naval battle. They know this. The U.S. knows this. Everyone knows this. So Iran doesn't plan to fight conventionally. Iran's military doctrine, developed specifically to counter American naval power, is called asymmetric warfare. And in the Strait of Hormuz, they've developed what analysts call the swarm doctrine. Here's how it works. The IRGC, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, operates hundreds of small, fast attack boats, armed with rockets, torpedoes, and anti-ship missiles. They can launch from hidden coastal bases, disperse across the narrow strait, and overwhelm a single warship's defensive systems with sheer numbers. Think of it like this. A wolf is more powerful than any individual dog. But a pack of 200 dogs? That changes the math. Beyond the swarm boats, Iran has something even more dangerous. The Noor, the Khalij Fars, and the Hormuz, domestically produced ballistic and cruise missiles, specifically designed to hit large surface ships. The Khalij Fars is a ballistic missile with a maneuvering warhead. It can hit a moving ship from over 300 kilometers away. No aircraft carrier has ever faced a threat quite like that in actual combat. And then there are the mines. Iran has one of the world's largest stockpiles of naval mines. During any conflict, they would almost certainly attempt to seed the Strait of Hormuz, turning those 2-mile shipping lanes into a deadly obstacle course. Beyond the water, Iran holds another card. Its proxy network. Hezbollah in Lebanon. Houthi forces in Yemen, who, as we've already seen in 2024, are capable of targeting commercial and military ships in the Red Sea with drones and missiles. Iraqi militias. All of them could activate simultaneously, opening multiple fronts and forcing the U.S. to divide its attention and resources. A U.S. blockade of Iran would not be a clean surgical operation. It would be brutal. It would be costly. And it would be the beginning of something no one can fully predict. Let's step back from the military picture for a moment. Because a blockade of Iran wouldn't just be a military event. It would be an economic earthquake felt in every corner of the world. Day one of a confirmed blockade, oil prices would likely spike 30 to 50%. Within a week, if tankers stop moving through the strait, we're talking double, potentially triple. Why? Because the global oil market runs on confidence and predictability. The moment that predictability vanishes, panic sets in. China imports roughly 40% of its oil from the Persian Gulf. A disruption of that supply doesn't just slow the Chinese economy, it destabilizes one of the key pillars of the global financial system. Japan and South Korea are almost entirely dependent on Middle Eastern oil. India, the world's third largest oil importer, sources nearly 60% of its crude from the region. These are not small economies. These are the engine rooms of global manufacturing and technology. In Europe, natural gas prices, already historically high since the Ukraine conflict, would spike further. Heating, electricity, industrial production. And in the United States, despite domestic production growth, America is deeply integrated into the global oil market. Gas prices at the pump would soar. Inflation, which had only just been brought under control, could reignite. Airlines would ground flights. Shipping companies would reroute around Africa, adding weeks to delivery times and billions to costs. Global supply chains, still fragile after years of disruption, would buckle. The International Monetary Fund has modeled scenarios like this. Their estimates suggest a prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz could shave 3 to 5% off global GDP. To put that in perspective, the 2008 financial crisis shrank global GDP by about 2.1%. We would be looking at something potentially worse than the Great Recession, triggered not by financial fraud or bank failures, but by two nations staring each other down across 21 miles of water. Here's the part that should make every viewer sit up straight. We are not talking about a hypothetical Cold War scenario. The pieces are already moving. Since 2019, Iran has seized or harassed over a dozen commercial ships in the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman. Some were held for months, crews detained. The U.S. has responded by deploying additional naval assets, including a carrier strike group and a nuclear submarine, to the region, moves explicitly described by the Pentagon as deterrent signals. Iran's nuclear program has crossed thresholds that, just 5 years ago, Western intelligence agencies said would be red lines. Their uranium enrichment is now at levels that put a nuclear weapon within months of technical reach, not years. The diplomatic channels that existed under the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, have effectively collapsed. Back-channel negotiations have stalled. Neither side trusts the other enough to make concessions. And in the background, the Houthi missile and drone campaign in the Red Sea, which Iran arms and supports, has already demonstrated that Iranian-aligned forces are willing and able to target international shipping. Multiple U.S. Navy ships have been targeted by Houthi missiles in the Red Sea in the last 18 months. American sailors have been in combat. Drones have been shot down. Missiles intercepted. This isn't a fire drill anymore. The scenario of a U.S. blockade of Iran is no longer a think tank thought experiment. It is a real option on the table, debated in the Pentagon, in Congress, in the halls of allied governments. The question is not whether it is possible. The question is, what is the trigger? What is the one event, the one escalation, that pushes it from option on a table to orders given at sea? An Iranian nuclear test? An attack on a U.S. warship? A proxy strike that kills American troops in large numbers? History doesn't announce its turning points in advance. They arrive suddenly. They arrive quietly. And then everything is different. Let's bring it all together. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. And it may be the most consequential 21 miles on Earth. A U.S. naval blockade of Iran would be an act of war. It would require an unprecedented deployment of American military power, carrier strike groups, submarines, aircraft, cyber assets, and the full weight of U.S. diplomatic pressure to hold together an international coalition. Iran would not surrender quietly. They would respond with asymmetric warfare, swarm attacks, anti-ship missiles, mines, proxy strikes across the region. The diplomatic channels that existed under the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, have effectively collapsed. Back-channel negotiations have stalled. Neither side trusts the other enough to make concessions. And in the background, the Houthi missile and drone campaign in the Red Sea, which Iran arms and supports, has already demonstrated that Iranian-aligned forces are willing and able to target international shipping. Multiple U.S. Navy ships have been targeted by Houthi missiles in the Red Sea in the last 18 months. American sailors have been in combat. Drones have been shot down. Missiles intercepted. This isn't a fire drill anymore. The scenario of a U.S. blockade of Iran is no longer a think tank thought experiment. It is a real option on the table, debated in the Pentagon, in Congress, in the halls of allied governments. The question is not whether it is possible. The question is, what is the trigger? What is the one event, the one escalation, that pushes it from option on a table to orders given at sea? An Iranian nuclear test? An attack on a U.S. warship? A proxy strike that kills American troops in large numbers? History doesn't announce its turning points in advance. They arrive suddenly. They arrive quietly. And then everything is different. Let's bring it all together. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. And it may be the most consequential 21 miles on Earth. A U.S. naval blockade of Iran would be an act of war. It would require an unprecedented deployment of American military power, carrier strike groups, submarines, aircraft, cyber assets, and the full weight of U.S. diplomatic pressure to hold together an international coalition. Iran would not surrender quietly. They would respond with asymmetric warfare, swarm attacks, anti-ship missiles, mines, proxy strikes across the region.